When I was a little girl, my mother told me where babies come from. She said, when two people love each other, sometimes there's so much extra love that the love becomes a baby. And I believed her. I could picture it perfectly. I pictured a man and a woman in love, and a cloud of love surrounding them, and the cloud slowly coalescing into a baby in the woman's arms. I persisted in believing her, even while in elementary school, my friends told me about the mechanics of how a baby is made. And I just continued to hold both beliefs until one day I was watching television. And the particular show I was watching was an American sitcom called Three's Company. Let me tell you a little bit about, to give you a sense of this show. This was a show, the premise was that Jack was living with, as his roommates, he had Janet and Chrissy, two women. But the landlord didn't think it was okay for a man to have women roommates. So Jack pretended to be gay, and that made it okay. So that gives you a sense of the kind of humor in the show. On this particular episode, Jack noted that I was watching on this day, Jack notices that Chrissy is sneaking around meeting with all these different strange men. And he gets it into his head that what Chrissy is doing is interviewing strange men to hire someone to impregnate her. That's not really what she's doing. She's interviewing interior designers to redecorate the bedroom that she shares with Janet as a surprise. But I thought about what Jack imagined was going on, and the realization hit me. I ran down to the kitchen and I said, "Mommy, two people can make a baby without being in love." And she was shocked. Now, my realization was correct. Two people can definitely make a baby without being in love. But I also think that the story that my mother told me contains a profound truth. Love can make a baby. Sometimes love makes a baby because two people are in love and they make love and they make a baby that way. But there are other ways that love can make a baby. For example, let me tell you a story from another American TV show, a more recent show from about 15 years ago called The L Word. It was about lesbians. And there was a couple named Tina and Bet, and they were deeply in love, and they were a serious couple, and they lived together, and they wanted to make a baby and raise a baby together. Now, as much as those two women made love, they were not going to make a baby that way. But they found someone willing to donate sperm, and Tina got pregnant, and she gave birth to a baby. Sadly, things didn't work out in the relationship between Tina and Bet. They split up, but Bet wanted partial custody of the baby. She was not genetically related to the baby, and she had not carried the baby. But she said, "Tina, we conceived of this baby together." And I love that line. I think it's a play on words. They didn't conceive the baby, but they conceived of the baby together. But there's something really importantly true in what Bet was saying. She was saying, this baby came from us. Our love made us make this plan to make the baby and raise the baby, and the baby is the product of our love. So love can make a baby without any lovemaking. That happens when we have a couple that's two women or a couple that's two men who want to make a baby together. or when a straight couple finds that they face infertility, a couple might take advantage of in vitro fertilization. They might hire a sperm donor or an egg donor, or they might hire a gestational surrogate. These are all different ways that your love can give rise to a baby, even if there's no lovemaking involved. So today's topic, love can make a baby without any lovemaking. Does that have a morally significant upshot? I'm going to suggest that it does. I'm going to have us think seriously about what happens when two people who love each other want to make a baby, and the kind of help that they need requires hiring a gestational surrogate, another person to carry the fetus, to nurture the fetus into a baby. And I'm going to ask us to think about abortion in that context. How does abortion in the context of gestational surrogacy differ from abortion in non-surrogacy contexts? How should a pregnant person make a decision whether to abort when she is carrying someone else's fetus? And what makes a fetus or a baby mine or ours or theirs? I'm going to have us think about why a gestational surrogate needs a right to abortion and why we need gestational surrogates to have a right to abortion. So we're going to talk about gestational surrogacy, and before we get started, I want to say three things about gestational surrogacy. First, there are some worries, some concerns that people have. Some people think that having money involved in the creation of children is problematic. Paying an egg donor or paying a sperm donor or paying a gestational surrogate seems problematic. The money seems problematic. Another concern that people have about gestational surrogacy is they think it's wrong to hire a gestational surrogate, or it's at least morally problematic because it's exploitative of the surrogates. I think that both of those thoughts are mistaken. And I think a helpful analogy to hiring a gestational surrogate is hiring a nanny. So if you hire a nanny or you hire a gestational surrogate, in both cases, you're hiring someone to take care of your child. The fact that they're being paid in no way means that they don't care about the child they're taking care of, and hopefully they do. The fact that you're paying them in no way speaks ill of you, and in some ways addresses some concerns about exploitation. But nannies certainly can be exploited and are sometimes exploited, and so are gestational surrogates, and so that's a part of the analogy that is helpful. But I think there can be instances of hiring nannies that are non-exploitative, and I think the same for hiring gestational surrogates. There are disanalogies also, of course, but I think the analogy is illuminating. The final thing I want to say before diving in is that I started today's talk by telling you a true story about my childhood. And in the first two lectures, I told a number of true stories from my life. And in lecture one, some true stories from my friends' lives too. And the stories that we're going to talk about gestational surrogacy are stories that I've made up. But I hope that we'll take seriously that there are real people living versions of these stories, and let's try to take the emotional reality of the stories seriously. Okay. So Carmen and Steve fall in love and get married, and they want to make a baby and raise a baby together. But they find that it's hard for them to make a baby. They find that Carmen can't sustain a pregnancy, and they start looking into surrogacy. Meanwhile, Daphne is a mother of two, She enjoyed being pregnant. She found it pleasant and easy. Women differ wildly in their experiences of pregnancy. Some people find pregnancy very difficult and hard, and some people find it easy. And women who find pregnancy easy are better candidates to be gestational surrogates. Daphne likes the idea of helping a couple to have a baby, and she could use the money. So she meets Carmen and Steve and agrees to be their gestational surrogate. And then Daphne gets pregnant. Now, in talking about this situation, we're inclined to say Daphne is carrying their baby. And I want to ask, what makes it true that it's their baby she's carrying? Now, in many versions of this story, we can just say, well, she's carrying a fetus that is genetically related to Carmen and Steve, a fetus that came from Carmen's egg and Steve's sperm. But let me tell you more about Carmen and Steve. They faced a number of challenges in their quest to make a baby, and they've actually brought in a number of people's help. So they've hired an egg donor and a sperm donor, as well as Daphne to be the gestational surrogate. And they're not genetically related to the baby she's carrying, but it's still true that Daphne is carrying their baby. So what makes that true? Well, we might say she's carrying a fetus that is going to become a baby that they're going to raise. So we just look into the future and we point at the future and say, she's carrying the fetus that becomes their child in the future. And I think in many cases that is a good answer to the question, what makes it their baby? But for our purposes today, we're going to be thinking about cases in which there's a surrogate pregnancy and the question of abortion comes up, and we're going to be asking moral questions about what should happen now. And so it's going to be a live question for us whether there is any future in which this fetus becomes a baby, because abortion is one possibility of what might happen now. And so we're not going to be able, in thinking about how decisions should be made now, to rely on the assumption that the fetus becomes a baby. We're not going to be allowed to rely on that. But we still want to say that Daphne is carrying their fetus. What makes that true? So the view that I want to put on the table, and I'm just saying, here's an interesting view. I think it's true, but it's a conjecture. I'm not arguing for it. Is the love conjecture. When two people are in love, and their love creates a baby or a fetus, this makes the baby or fetus theirs in a way that matters morally. So my answer, why is it true that Daphne is carrying their fetus? Because that fetus came about from their love. How does it matter morally that it's theirs? Well, I think there are a number of implications. So there may ultimately be implications for parental rights and responsibilities, such as Bet was urging to Tina on the L word. But I think there are also implications for how questions about abortion should be decided during the pregnancy. All right, let's turn the page. So I'm going to talk us through 3 different situations that can arise in which abortion is considered during a surrogate pregnancy. And first, I want us to think about an abortion that would be breaking a promise. So in this version of the story, when Daphne becomes pregnant with Carmen and Steve's embryo, she very quickly becomes deeply ill at ease with the pregnancy in a way that surprises her. She didn't expect this at all. But she's very distressed to be carrying other people's fetus. And she knows what pregnancy is like, and in anticipating the experiences of pregnancy with the fetus of a stranger in her body, she was really freaking out about it. And she can't quite say what is upsetting her. Is it that it seems awful to have a fetus to whom she's wholly unconnected in her body that she's nurturing and taking care of? Or is it more that she's worried that she will become too connected to the fetus and it will be too hard to give up the fetus upon giving birth? She's not sure which it is. Is it that she's too alienated from the fetus or not alienated enough? She doesn't know. But what she knows is that the situation feels intolerable to her, and she thinks it over and feels great distress, and finally approaches Harman and Steve and says, this is going really poorly for me, and she tells them what's going on with her psychologically, and she says, I think I'm probably going to have an abortion. And Harman and Steve are devastated because they've been trying for so long to make a baby, and they've come so far in that process, and here they are. The pregnancy is in progress, and it's unbearable to them, and they beg her to continue the pregnancy. So now what should happen? Daphne made a promise to do this, and she signed a contract to do it. Should Harman and Steve be able to stop her from aborting? Well, I doubt there's anyone here who thinks they should be able to do that. She's in the early stages of pregnancy. She's a pregnant woman who wants to end the pregnancy. Abortion should be available to her. But there's a further question that arises after we all agree that she should be able to choose an abortion, which is a question about her decision. What should she decide, and how should she decide, and would it be wrong for her to abort? So it could be that no one should stop her from aborting, and yet it would be wrong for her to abort. Is she morally required to continue the pregnancy? Here again, I doubt that anyone here thinks that it would be wrong for her to abort. Given what I've described of her mental anguish, this just turns out to be the wrong thing for her. It does seem like, all things considered, she should abort. It seems like it's permissible for her to abort. What I want us to spend a bit of time thinking about is the explanation of why it's permissible for her to abort, because the promise that she made is a big one and a weighty one. And when you promise big things to people, you need really good reasons to break those promises. In trying to explain why it's permissible for Daphne to abort, we might start by thinking about the fact that pregnancy involves intimacy with another being. In pregnancy, you're taking care of another being and sharing your body with another being. This is something that the philosopher Maggie Little and others have emphasized. And we might think about another kind of intimacy, the intimacy of sex, as helpfully relevant to this. So we might think maybe the following claim is true. It's never morally wrong to break a promise to be intimate with someone. For example, in sex. So here's a case that sort of suggests that this principle is correct, and this is a case that the philosopher Hallie Liberto offers in a paper. In this case, so this is the case that I call sex-ick. Julie and Jim are dating, and they haven't had sex yet, but they're both excited to have sex. And Julie says to Jim, if you win the football game Friday night, I'll have sex with you Friday night. Now, this is a story, I'm sorry to say, in the US, so it's American football. So Jim wins the game, and then there they are. It's time to have the sex that Julie promised they would have. And in that moment, to Julie's surprise, the thought, she thinks about having sex with Jim, and her reaction is, ick. She promised to have sex with him. Does that make it okay for him to force her to have sex? Of course not. Is she doing something morally wrong if she now says no to sex, having promised? Also, no, it's morally permissible for her to not have sex with him even though she promised. Okay, so this is a kind of case that supports the idea that it's never morally wrong to break a promise to be intimate with someone. But I think that's not true, and let me give you another case to show that that general principle, I think, is false. This is a case that I call sex tired. Ken and Kevin are married, and they have a wonderful, fulfilling sex life. But they're also busy. And so, finding that they're so busy, Ken promises Kevin, we'll have sex on Tuesday night. Tuesday comes around, and Ken finds that he's a little tired. He knows that if he went ahead and started fooling on with Kevin, he'd have a great time, they'd have wonderful sex, it would be lovely, he wouldn't even remember that he'd been tired. But he feels tired, so he doesn't do that, he just reneges on the deal. He breaks his promise. So Ken promised to have sex with Kevin. Does that make it okay for Kevin to force him to have sex? Definitely not. Is Ken doing something morally wrong in not fulfilling his promise? I think there's versions of this case in which, yes, he's doing something morally wrong. He should do what he promised. So I think that shows that it's not in general true that it's never morally wrong to break a promise to be intimate with someone. So I think we haven't yet found an explanation of why it's okay for Daphne to abort her pregnancy. Another approach would say, well, pregnancy is a medically serious thing that you go through. It involves medical risks, it involves medical engagement with the world of medicine in a variety of ways to be healthy and safe. And we might think, look, it's just never morally wrong to break a promise to go through a medically significant procedure or experience. The fact that there's this, this is the kind of thing that you can always opt out of. But I think that's not true either. Suppose that Mary promised a stranger named Max that she would give him her kidney. And she's all set to do it, but then some Taylor Swift concert tickets come her way. And so she backs out of giving Max the kidney to go to a Taylor Swift concert. Now, as I revealed in lecture 2, I think Taylor Swift is amazing. But I don't think this is adequate justification for breaking her promise to give Max a kidney. It's a really weighty promise. You need a better reason than that to break it. So it's just not true that in general, promises to do medically serious things can always be broken. So perhaps we should look at a different aspect of Daphne's desire to abort, which is her visceral aversion to staying pregnant. And we might say, well, look, it's never morally wrong to break a promise to do something that you turn out to be viscerally averse to doing. And this principle would both explain, if it's true, it would explain why it's okay for Daphne to abort, and it would explain why it's okay in the sex-ick case for Julie to not have sex with Jim, to break that promise. But I actually think that this principle is not true either. Suppose that Louis promised a stranger named Louise that he would give her his kidney. But then he shows up at the hospital on the day of the surgeries, and he just is overwhelmed by a feeling of that it's gross to imagine a healthy part of his body being cut out and put into someone else's body. That's awful to him. I actually don't think that makes it okay for him to back out of giving her a kidney. So I think this principle is also not true. I think to explain why it's okay for Daphne to abort her pregnancy, and it's okay for Julie to not have sex with Jim, even though she promised, we should appeal to a principle that takes intimacy and visceral aversion both into account. So I think it's never morally wrong to break a promise, to go through an experience that involves intimacy with someone else, if you are viscerally averse to it and you anticipate the visceral aversion continuing during the experience. That, I think, is the real explanation of why it's okay for Daphne to abort. In this section, we've been thinking about surrogate pregnancy and that it involves a promise to do something, and it's a weighty promise that you need good reasons to break. Now I want to turn to talking about another kind of case in which abortion might be considered in a surrogate pregnancy. So this is a case in which abortion is requested. So Daphne gets pregnant with Carmen and Steve's fetus, and the usual genetic tests are performed early in the pregnancy, and the fetus is diagnosed with a genetic abnormality. And Carmen and Steve are so upset to come to the view that, all things considered, they would like Daphne to abort. They think that's what they would prefer. That's what they think the right choice to make is in light of the genetic diagnosis. And it's very sad for them because they have tried for so long to make a baby. But then they find that Daphne is reluctant to abort. So here we have a case in which Carmen and Steve want Daphne to abort, and she's reluctant to abort. What should happen? Let's think about this from Carmen and Steve's perspective for a minute. Because the situation may feel really unfair to them. Some people who want to make a baby, it just comes so easily to them. They want to make a baby, they can make love and make a baby. Carmen and Steve have had to go through so much, it's so hard, and here they are, and decisions that in some ways, if things were fair, would just be their decisions. There's this other person involved. The kind of unfairness that I'm talking about was partly captured in something that my friend Jennifer said to me once. So Jennifer was trying to get pregnant, and she and her wife Lisa had a week vacation in Paris planned. They live in New York. So they were going to go on this romantic trip to Paris. And then Jennifer found out that she was going to be ovulating while they were on their romantic vacation, and she said to me, "It's so unfair. Other people, if they were trying to make a baby and they had a romantic week in Paris planned, and that was when the ovulation was happening, it would just be perfect. They could just make love a lot with the Eiffel Tower out the window and make a baby. But I have to be here, near my doctor, near the frozen sperm." And she was really frustrated. Things seemed unfair to her. And so one might say about Carmen and Steve and Daphne, look, the decision whether to abort, it should just belong to Carmen and Steve. It should be their decision, because if things were fair in the world, they'd be doing it on their own. It would just be their decision. It's unfair to them that Daphne's involved. And what I want to say about this is it is unfair. This is a situation that's unfair. But you can't ignore the reality that this pregnancy is happening in Daphne's body, and letting Carmen and Steve choose an abortion would be letting them force an abortion on Daphne, and of course it's not okay to do that. So this is not right. So you might say instead, look, the decision should be Daphne's alone because it's her body. And that's true as far as whether anything should be forced on Daphne. A gestational surrogate should not be forced to stay pregnant, as we discussed in the last section, and a gestational surrogate should not be forced to abort. It's her body. But there's still this further question of how given that the decision is up to her, there's this question about how she should decide. And here what I want to say is that Daphne should weigh heavily Harman and Steve's preference that she abort because she's carrying their fetus. What makes it their fetus? My hypothesis is that it's because it was made by their love. If she chooses to continue the pregnancy despite their preference, she's insisting on continuing the creation of their child contrary to their preference. That's a very serious thing to do to other people. Let's turn the page. The third case I want to talk about is a case in which not aborting is requested. So in this version of the story, again, genetic tests are performed early in the pregnancy, and the fetus is diagnosed with a genetic abnormality. In this case, it's Daphne who thinks that she should abort based on the genetic abnormality, but Harman and Steve ask her to continue the pregnancy. What should happen? Well, one thought is that a person should be guided by their own conscience. Daphne believes that she should abort, so she should. But it's not true that a person should be guided by their own conscience. And let me tell you two stories to convince you. The first story involves Frank, who's a member of a mafia crime family. The way that the crime family supports its business, one of the ways, is that they go to all the businesses in town and they say, hey, we want you to pay us for protection. And what they mean is you pay us money on a regular basis and we don't do horrible things to you. So they're extorting money from all the local businesses. And then there's a new store owner in town, and he doesn't want to pay the extortion. He's not paying the extortion, and this poses a real danger to the financial health of the mafia family. If this is unaddressed, it could spark others to not pay. It could be very serious. Now, Frank believes that morality is fundamentally a matter of loyalty, taking care of your own. And he believes that he has a great duty of loyalty to the other members of the mafia family to do something about this situation. He thinks he owes it to them to kill the shop owner who's not paying. This is his sincere moral belief. But the fact that Frank believes that he should kill the shop owner does not make it true that he should. The second story is one in which the genetic condition that is revealed in Daphne's fetus is a genetic predisposition to be gay. And in this version of the story, Daphne is homophobic and thinks this is a good reason to abort. But it's not a good reason to abort, and her thinking it is doesn't make it so. So it's just not true that a person should be guided by their own conscience. Instead, the moral truth about Daphne's situation matters to what she should do. This means, among other things, that it does matter whether abortion is morally permissible, and that's something that we addressed in lecture 2. And in that lecture, I offered the view that I call the ever-conscious view, on which a living being has moral status just in case it's ever conscious. That is, a living being has moral status throughout its life, just in case there's any moment in its life at which it's conscious. It follows from this view that an abortion that kills a fetus before it's ever conscious is killing a being that lacks moral status, and there's no moral reason against that abortion. It also matters what genetic condition was diagnosed in Daphne's fetus. Suppose it's a genetic condition that would lead the baby to have a brief life of great suffering. In that case, anyone whose fetus is diagnosed with that condition, anyone in that situation should abort, and Daphne should as well, and it doesn't matter what Carmen and Steve want. But many of us think that there are other genetic conditions such that it's reasonable if you want to abort on the basis of that genetic condition, but it's also reasonable to choose to continue a pregnancy even in the face of that diagnosis. So suppose that it's a genetic condition such that in general, it's morally permissible to abort because of that condition, but it's also morally permissible to continue the pregnancy. If that's the kind of genetic condition we're talking about, then I claim the preferences of Carmen and Steve should weigh heavily in Daphne's decision because she is carrying their fetus. And I hypothesize that what makes it their fetus is that it's the product of their love. In the next two sections of the talk, I want to talk through some of the ways that what we're talking about today relates to some of the things that I said in lectures 1 and 2. So let's start with, what can love do? Can love expand the moral community? In lecture 2, I asked whether love can endow moral status. Can the mere fact that you love something that doesn't independently already count morally bring it into the moral community and give it moral status and make it count morally? And I argued that the answer is no. But can two people's love make a baby? Yes. Love can bring into existence a being with moral status, and that is a way that love expands the moral community. And can two people's love make a baby theirs by making the baby? I think yes. Let's turn the page. Let's turn to thinking about how abortion in the context of gestational surrogacy compares to abortion in non-surrogacy contexts. Let me start by reminding some of you what I said in lecture 1, or telling some of you for the first time, if you were not able to come to lecture 1, what I said in lecture 1. So in lecture 1, I talked about why we need abortion. Why do we need abortion rights? Why do we need access to abortion? And I said, it's so that girls and women and anyone who can get pregnant are not forced to be pregnant. But it's also so that girls and women are not forced into motherhood. And I said that outlawing abortion can force girls and women into motherhood even if there's an option of relinquishing the baby you've given birth to, because if forced to continue our pregnancies, many of us are such that we realize that in the course of being forced to turn our fetuses into babies, we will come to love them and be unwilling to give them up. We also need abortion so that many boys and men are not forced into fatherhood. I talked about the decision that a pregnant girl or woman makes about whether to abort, and I said there's an important asymmetry regarding that decision. If a pregnant girl or woman is inclined to continue her pregnancy, she should really discuss this with the father of the fetus and find out what he wants. If his preference is that she abort, but he also knows about himself that if she turns their fetus into a baby, that he will feel that that's his baby and he will want to play an active role in raising that child, then continuing her pregnancy means that he will be forced into fatherhood. That is a big deal. A pregnant girl or woman should weigh heavily the preference of the fetus's father that she abort. By contrast, if a pregnant girl or woman is inclined to abort, I think she can just go ahead. I don't think she has any obligation or need to find out the preferences of the fetus's father or consult him. If she prefers to abort and he prefers that she continue the pregnancy, that's a lot like him wanting her to make a baby for him. And we're not, in general, under any duty to take seriously other people's desires that we make babies for them. So there's that asymmetry. A pregnant girl or woman should take seriously the fetus's father's preference that she abort, if that's his preference, but need not take seriously a preference that she continue the pregnancy. By contrast, there's no corresponding asymmetry when it comes to gestational surrogate pregnancies. A gestational surrogate should weigh heavily the preferences of the intended parents that she abort, if that's what they would prefer. But gestational surrogacy is making a baby for someone else. That's what you've signed up for in starting it. A gestational surrogate who promised to do that for a couple should take their desire that she continue the pregnancy seriously. It's symmetrical. Okay, let's turn to the question, why do gestational surrogates need abortion, a right to abortion, access to abortion? Well, definitely so that they are not forced to continue to be pregnant. But in the case of gestational surrogacy, abortion is not needed so that the pregnant people are not forced into motherhood. There's no danger for a gestational surrogate of being forced into motherhood. It's not available to her. What this means is that in lecture 1, I talked about how the right to abortion is both a right to end a pregnancy and a right to kill the fetus, and that's important because that's relevant to not being forced into motherhood. And what we see here is that the right that a gestational surrogate has, the abortion right that the gestational surrogate has, is merely a right to end a pregnancy and is in no way also a right to kill the fetus, not a distinct right to kill the fetus. Why do we need gestational surrogates to have access to abortion? Well, so that their rights are protected, but also so that intended parents have the option of stopping a procreative process that they have started. This is analogous to the fact that one of the reasons that we need abortion is so that men are not forced into fatherhood. Across 3 lectures, I've talked about love and abortion. I've been making the case that taking love seriously illuminates abortion. I've talked about 3 kinds of love. We started by talking about, in lecture 1, by talking about anticipated love for a fetus one does not love now, a fetus one wants to kill. I said that this kind of love explains why we need abortion. It's because of this anticipated love that we may have if we're forced to turn the fetus into a baby, that outlawing abortion forces us into motherhood. That kind of love doesn't give us the whole explanation of why we need abortion. We also need abortion so that we're not forced into pregnancy. But in lecture 1, I said there's a possible future in which artificial gestation technology advances so much that love actually would give us the whole explanation of why we need abortion. In lecture 2, I talked about a very different attitude towards early fetuses. I talked about love of the fetus from the very beginning of pregnancy, from the beginning of knowing that one is pregnant. Does this love show that something morally bad happens in an abortion? I argued it does not. We talked about whether loving a fetus gives it moral status, endows moral status, and I said it does not. But does love of the fetus from the very beginning of pregnancy show that some early fetuses have moral status? I think yes. Today, we've been talking about romantic love that makes a baby. I've offered the love conjecture that when two people's love makes a baby, that makes the baby theirs. We've thought about abortion in the context of gestational surrogacy. We've noted that gestational surrogates have the same bodily integrity rights as any pregnant person, but their right to abortion is really just a right to end a pregnancy and not also a distinct right to kill the fetus. How should a gestational surrogate decide whether to abort or continue a pregnancy? Well, gestational surrogates, like other pregnant people, are carrying a fetus that is someone else's. Every pregnant person is carrying a fetus that has another parent. But for gestational surrogates, the fetus is wholly someone else's. Their preferences should weigh heavily for her, and it's symmetrical. If they prefer she abort, that should weigh heavily, and if they prefer that she continue the pregnancy, that should weigh heavily. What makes the fetus theirs? Sometimes I think it's love. Some of us know about ourselves that we exist in this world because two people love each other. My parents, Gilbert and Lucy, fell in love, and that's why I am here, and my sister Olivia is here. My husband, Alex, and I fell in love, and that's why our daughters, Annie and Rosie, about whom I've talked in these lectures, that's why they are here in this world. It's a profound thing to know about yourself, that you're the product of two people's love, and I suggest it explains why you are theirs.
I wanted to talk about the love conjecture. And so I find your claim that the fact that love is involved in making a baby has some kind of really important moral significance. I find that very plausible and interesting, but I would like to push on whether its significance lies in the fact that it's what makes the baby theirs. And so I'm thinking of cases, and I'm wondering whether it's just something to do with their intentional agency in producing the baby. So, you can imagine someone who makes a baby through a surrogate, but not out of love and not out of anticipated love, but to give in to societal pressures to have a family to look a certain way, or whatever other kind of reason that does not involve love. And in that case, you might think that it's still their baby, so love isn't necessary. And you might also think there are cases where love isn't even sufficient to make a baby someone's. And the case I had in mind here was if the surrogate, for example, comes to love the baby, and in fact, for that reason, sees through the making of the baby. It also is not clear that we want to say that that makes this baby theirs rather than the original parents, as it were. So thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. So I think there's two questions. So one question, I'll start with the second question you raised. One question is, can't someone be motivated in helping to make a baby or making a baby? Can't they be motivated by love without the baby becoming in any way theirs? For example, a gestational surrogate might feel love for the fetus she's carrying, much like a nanny might feel love for the kid she's taking care of, but in neither case does that make them a parent of the child in question. I think that that's right. And the love conjecture is just a little bit more of a specific claim. So it's particularly about romantic love. So it's about two people being in love and their love creating a baby. So it's also about love between two people making a baby. So the love conjecture is actually not about love of the child. It's about love between the people who make the baby. Okay, so then the first question that you asked was, is it really love that's doing the work of making the created child belong to the people whose love created it, or isn't it rather that the love gives rise to a plan, and the plan makes the baby? There's this intention that we're going to make this baby and raise the baby. So I definitely agree, and also you asked, wouldn't the plan be enough to make the baby theirs without the love? For example, we could imagine a couple who are married who have great mutual respect for each other and who are not in love and were never in love, and they want to make a child and raise a child together, and they find that they need some help, and they hire a gestational surrogate, and they have a similar story to the stories I've been telling. And wouldn't it be true that the baby, the fetus and the baby was theirs because of the plan? It was their plan that brought the fetus about. So I think this is a great place to press against the love conjecture. So I do agree that the couple who merely respect each other and don't love each other who make the plan to make the baby, I do agree that the fetus and the baby is theirs. But I don't think that it follows that in the case where love makes the plan that makes the baby, that the plan rather than the love is doing the work. And I think that this raises deep questions about what the real explanation or real cause of something is. So I think that the deep explanation of the existence of the child is from the love, which gives rise to the plan, and that's why I think it's the love that also makes it true that it's theirs. But I don't really have a knockdown argument for that. In some ways, I'm just sort of trying to articulate what the love conjecture claims in answering.
Lovely. Fiona.
Fiona Clark. Actually wanted to build on that question about the gestational mother coming to love the baby, because I don't know what the law is in the States, but here, the gestational mother, if she wants to keep the baby, that is hers, because she is the person who has grown the baby inside her body. Her body is actually made much more of the baby than the original sperm and egg. And as you said in your example, it may not even be the intended parent's sperm and egg that made that baby. So I think there is much more on the gestational side than you're allowing for. It's not just a business contract. Remember, here you can't pay a surrogate, you can only pay expenses. It is a promise, but that person has that fetus and then baby inside their body for 9 months, feeding it, nurturing it. I think that can become real love in a way that you're not accounting for.
Okay, thank you so much, Fiona. So can I just clarify? So, Fiona, are you saying that the law in England is that if someone is acting as a gestational surrogate for a couple and she's carrying a fetus that is like wholly the couple's genetic child, she has a legal option to claim parenthood and raise the child, keeping them from having any parental entitlement to the child? Okay, well, thank you so much. That's super interesting. And I didn't know that about English law. So Fiona's question is, aren't I discounting the relationship between the gestational surrogate and the child and the kind of meaningful, loving relationship that can be there and the implications for parenthood that arise? And so Fiona explained to me that the law in England actually allows a gestational surrogate to decide to claim parental rights, thus ruling out the otherwise intended parents as parents of the child that she's gestated. And you might think that England is getting something right and having that be the law. So that's super interesting. So there's so much to say, sorry. So one thing to say is in the United States, some decades ago, there was a really interesting custody battle over a child born to a gestational surrogate. But in that case, the gestational surrogate had also been the egg donor, so she was genetically related to the child. It was called the Baby M case. There was a lot of press about it. And one thing that happened is it became best practices with surrogacy for the gestational surrogate to not have a genetic relationship to the child, and the idea was to lessen the gestational surrogate's moral claim and legal claim to parenthood of the child. So my reaction to the law in England is that seems like a law that makes it really difficult for people who want to use gestational surrogacy to create a child to have any security, and particularly alarming if you are using your own genetic material to make the baby. So because I think surrogacy can be a reasonable process, I feel concerned that the law is getting something wrong. I think it's definitely true that in gestating a baby, you might become very attached to the baby. That's also true, I will say, of nannying a baby. If you're carrying somebody else's fetus, I mean, I think it's clearest when there's the genetic relationship, but even if there's not the genetic relationship, I think that the agreement matters. I think it's not okay to enter into gestational surrogacy and then try to claim parenthood of the child, but it's super interesting to know that England allows it. One more thing to say about this is if the idea is that somehow entering into a loving relationship with a child can give you parental rights, I think it's just really complicated whether that's true. So, for example, nannies can develop very close relationships with children, and they can feel, I mean, I've known nannies who've said, I have a meaningful relationship with these children, the parents don't. And that doesn't change. I think the nannies are sometimes not correct about that, but that doesn't change who the real parents of the children are. There are lots of circumstances in which people develop close, loving relationships with children, and it is insufficient to make them the moral parents of the children. And I think gestational surrogacy is like that.
Yeah, this is a rather fanciful case, but
cool.
I mean, imagine a dictator and his wife who were deeply and romantically in love with each other, and they decided it would be a fantastic way of celebrating their love to randomly pair off their subjects and force them on pain of death to have sex with each other. And so it seems like, I mean, let's suppose they carry out that plan and thousands of babies are born as a result. So in a way, all those babies are made by their love. I mean, would you say that of the dictator and his wife, that all these babies are theirs?
Good. Okay, so Tim's question is, aren't there ways that two people's love could give rise to a baby and we wouldn't be at all inclined to say that the baby was theirs? For example, suppose a dictator and his wife decided to celebrate their love by insisting, that random pairings of citizens have sex and make babies. And it's not that they want to raise these babies, it's just like, it's the sort of sex that they're interested in happening to celebrate their love, but then as a result, all these babies are made. Aren't those babies not, in any interesting sense, babies that belong to the dictator and his wife? Yes, I totally agree about the case. I agree. So we shouldn't really adopt the love conjecture as our view. We should develop the view in certain ways. So it's not any way that love makes a baby that makes the baby yours. But more specifically, I mean, it's when love makes a baby through a plan that we're going to make a baby and raise the baby together, I think that makes the baby yours. That's really what I think. But then we can consider a variant case in which the dictator just picks out some random people and says, you're going to make a baby for us to raise. And then I think what it turns out is that if you do something if your love makes a baby by doing something super immoral to other people, that can mean that it doesn't become your baby. So I do think that when we fill out the details of the love conjecture, we're going to have to say more, and it's going to be a more specific view. I just agree. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Liz. This is amazing.
Oh, you're supposed to say your name, Danielle.
Oh, sorry. My name is Daniela Dover. I'm going to give myself the liberty of two questions since you were so quick. There's actually sort of related. But the first is like an analytic philosopher question, and the second is more of like a political theorist question. And I'd like to hear you just relate the two questions, or you could answer them separately. The analytic philosopher question is like, okay, so you're sort of very famous, for this kind of backward shape of things, right? It's because I in the future will be raising and loving this baby that it has a certain moral status in the present. And then today you've supplemented that with a forward-facing thing where it's because you and I conceived of this baby in the L-word example. It's because we loved at T1. Now the baby is conceived at T2. So in the normal case, the people at T1, T2, and T3 are all the same. And in surrogacy, you insert a third party at T2, the party who's gestating. I was wondering what you would say about a case where the early Harman backward motion comes apart from the parties in the recent forward motion. So Harman and Steve love each other so much, they make a baby, a fetus, an embryo, they put it in Daphne, then they change their mind, and they lovingly and responsibly make an adoption plan, and now Bob are meant to adopt the baby. And so now we've got 5 parties, 2 of whose love made the baby, 2 of who raised the baby, and they're coming to and then in thinking about this question, for me personally, the ownership metaphor that's embedded in their baby begins to feel just like it breaks down. And I would have been worried about it already because, it's a metaphor of property, and we really want to think about human beings that way at all. This idea of possession. But the minute you get 2 competing claims that are that strong, it seems like there's something almost like just heartbreaking about thinking about resolving it in either of their favor, in which case we might want to rethink it.
Okay, thank you so much, Daniela. So Daniela asks 2 related questions. So the first question, sorry, I think I'll answer the second question first. So one question is, what is this business of saying that a fetus is theirs? That sounds like ownership, and it's both metaphorical and it's an ownership metaphor, and that's troubling. I have to admit that I don't really think of it as an ownership metaphor, but I grant that people want to hear more about what it means. So I'm inclined to think that the relevant notion of being theirs is the question of whether a fetus or baby is theirs is the question of whether they are the moral parents of the fetus or baby. But what's weird about putting it that way is that sometimes we're talking about a being that doesn't have moral status. And so it can be odd to think about there being moral parents to a being without moral status. But I think that actually we should just think that that does happen, that like frozen embryos that are never going to be turned into persons that don't have moral status still have moral parents. So that's my inclination, is to say it's a parenthood relationship. It's a morally significant parenthood relationship. And partly a way of understanding it about the things that don't have moral status is if they were, if we, had they been turned into, had they been beings that have moral status, which is really like had they had different futures, on my view, then these would have been their parents. Daniela's first question is about a case in which parenthood rights and responsibilities are transferred. And I do think that that can happen. So suppose, and we can even have it happen even in one of these cases of gamete donation and gestational surrogacy. So Carmen and Steve want to make a baby. They find that they can't. They pay for an egg donor. They pay for a sperm donor. They hire Daphne as their surrogate. But then, by the time the baby is born, they don't like each other anymore, Carmen and Steve. They don't want to be a couple anymore. Let's suppose.
Sorry, that wasn't, so the example was like they disagree about the fetus while it's in Daphne. And so like let's say that
Oh, I see.
conditions
Because of the genetic condition.
yeah, and so then they say, but let's say it's not going to live just a day, right? It's
Sure.
going to live 3 years and somewhere horribly. And they say, well, if that baby comes out, if this fetus comes out as a baby, then I'm going to be forced. Carmen and Steve say I'm going to be forced into parenthood because it's my genetic material, and so for the exact same reason as you think that I should not be forced into being forced to carry the pregnancy to term. And then, Amy and Bob say, no, you won't be forced into parenthood. You've already made this adoption plan. So we're going to be the parents.
Okay. All right. So there's different kinds of cases that we can talk about. So one kind of case is a case in which Carmen and Steve make this plan to make a baby. They use an egg donor and a sperm donor, and they hire Daphne as their surrogate. She gets pregnant, and then a serious genetic abnormality is discovered in the fetus. And, as I said in the talk, Carmen and Steve might want Daphne to abort because they don't want this process of creating their baby to continue. Now, one thought you might have is if there's some other couple willing to raise the baby, that undermines Carmen and Steve's claim because they won't be forced to raise the baby because there's other people who are willing to raise the baby. I don't think that the presence of people willing to take on your parental rights like itself changes your parental rights and responsibilities in any way. It has to be that you're willing to take it up. So if Carmen and Steve, in fact, are such that they are open to somebody adopting the child and people are willing to adopt the child, that changes their situation. But if for whatever reason they're not open to other people adopting the child, the mere existence of people willing to adopt the child, I don't actually think has much of an impact on the moral decision. And then I would say, as Daniela was saying, on my view in lecture 2, the ever-conscious view, facts about the future can have moral repercussions in the present. But I don't think that facts that we don't know about adoption processes that are going to happen in the future really have much impact on how people should make decisions now. So we would have to already know that some adoption was going to happen in the future for it to be relevant to a current decision in a pregnancy about whether to abort. And then I think it might make sense to transfer the parental rights and responsibilities already, as opposed to just anticipating a future transfer. But those are interesting cases to think about. Thanks, Daniela.
Great. I have 10 people on the list, so we're going to try and get through. So I will limit people to just one question from this point. But if Liz manages to get through all those, and we've got more questions, you can have another added back to the bottom of the list. But please.
Hi, my name is Anita Allen. Earlier, the question arose about how British law might differ from American law. And, one thing to keep in mind is that in the United States, we have not one national surrogate parenting law, but we have 50 different states' jurisdictions, and so we have 50 different surrogate parenting laws. My question is about a common scenario in the United States, which is prompted by the fact that in some states, surrogacy is strongly discouraged by law, but one type of surrogacy that is permitted and not discouraged necessarily is where the surrogate mother, gestational surrogate mother, is a family member, the mother, the grandmother, or the sister of the woman who would like to have the intended mother. So what I wanted to ask you is about how you think through surrogacy arrangements between surrogates who are related by blood to the intended mother, because love often plays a huge role in those relationships. And it can even be that it's me and my sister who, because of our love, want to make a baby. Because sister wants to be an auntie, sister wants mommy to be grandmother, and yeah, the guy's important too, So this is not a question of where I'm challenging you, but rather a question which I'm asking you to expand upon your understanding of familial forms of love. You talk about romantic love, but there are other kinds of love which can have a very important role in surrogacy, especially where you have intrafamilial surrogacy arrangements.
Thank you so much, Anita. Anita, before I answer your question, could you just tell us about your heart lecture? What's the can we see, what's the title of your heart lecture?
Okay, so next Thursday at University College, Oxford, I'll be giving the H.L.A. Hart Memorial Lecture, and the title of my lecture is Unconditional Love, Some Implications for the Law. Please come.
So much. Thank you, Anita. Okay, so Anita asks, what about the fact that often enough, the gestational surrogate is not some stranger who's hired, but is rather a sister or mother who is acting as the gestational surrogate, not for any financial reasons, but out of love for the couple who want to raise a child and who will have a familial relationship to the created child. What do we think about that? How does that factor in? And Anita said, it's not an objection, but definitely, I mean, one thing to say is that there is a potential objection here, which is that sometimes out of love, someone participates in the making of a baby, but they're not a parent to the baby. It's not correct that they become one of the baby's parents. They're rather an aunt or a grandma. They have a different relationship to the baby than parent. And that's absolutely right. And so, but that is handled by the fact that the love conjecture is specifically about romantic love. What is also interesting to think about, though, is a case where two sisters, suppose that it's two sisters who were not partnered with other people, suppose that they want to live together and raise a baby together, and they love each other, and that's part of why they want to do it. Can their sisterly love making the baby lead the baby to be theirs? And I definitely acknowledge that the two sisters who make the plan to raise the baby together can both end up being parents to the baby. And I guess I'm a little undecided about whether the sisterly love is crucial there, because we can also just treat that like the case of the couple who respect each other and make a plan to make the baby. I think just the other things that I want to say are that I do think it's like an amazing thing that one person can do for someone else by being their surrogate. But I worry a little about laws that make that the best option for people, because I worry a little about pressure on family members to do it. But I think that's a beautiful gift that family members sometimes give each other. Thanks, Anita.
Tom.
Hi, I'm Tom Sinclair. I want to, like others, I'm interested in getting you to articulate more details of the love hypothesis, and I realize this is something you're still sketching out, but I wanted to know whether it's specific to babies made with love, or whether it extends to other things. So if a couple build a house together or something, and I'm conscious that although you're using the language of ownership a little, you actually, the kind of cash value of that is that the gestational surrogate must take into account the parents in a way that she might not have to in other cases. So that's not the same as saying that they are the parents or anything like that. So likewise, we might just think if two people who love each other build a house together and then for whatever reason can't live in it, other people should nevertheless, who do live in it, should nevertheless, I don't know, respect it in certain ways that they might not have to if it had not been built out of love.
Okay, thanks. So the question is, what if two people love each other and they want to make a life together in this house, and they build the house together out of their love, but then for whatever reason they don't end up living in it and other people live in it? Is it importantly in some sense still theirs because they made it out of their love? I certainly don't want to say that this is that kind of general phenomenon. I don't want to say that. But the closer analogy is when you're just living in the house for a while, and then they're going to get the house back, right? And then it does sort of seem more like you should take that it's their house into account. But no, I mean, I don't want to say it's more general that it would apply to making houses. Yes, thanks.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. My name is Giulia Cavaliere. So again, my question is on the conjecture again, and it's a version of the first question, the one Joanna asked at the start. So, and also in a way also the second to last. So I was thinking of all these cases where there is some kind of love involved, and there is a strong desire to have a baby. So say, for example, I'm approaching the age where I can't have children. I have a friend, Alberto is in the same situation, I don't know. There is no romantic love involved, but we really love each other. Yeah. We really love each other.
This is how he finds out.
No, sorry, I didn't hear you. Sorry. Okay, go on. Sorry, I didn't mean that. I was just thinking of, because I think these are like cases that I want to say that, for example, for two people who have other kinds of love that could be sisterly or a friendship or any other kind of love, I want to say that the baby is theirs in the same ways as like a romantic or a couple that has romantic love for one another. Now, all these cases, in my view, so what I was trying, because I really like your theory, so I was thinking, how can we fit it? And I was thinking, okay, maybe in certain cases, love makes a baby, but there are all these other cases where it's not love or where it's another kind of love. But then I was thinking, if we want to say this, I think we need, and that's why I'm inviting you to say a bit more if you want on the conjecture. We want to say what the relationship is between love and the fact that there is a baby that is someone's. Because in all the other theories of parental rights and responsibilities, there is something that gets considered independently important, and then this something then is key to assign somebody's or attribute to somebody's rights and responsibilities. And I really struggle to see how love, and especially romantic love, can be that something. So I think I came from like, there are all these other things that are important when we make a baby, also all kinds of love. And then I think the main reason was that I really struggle to see how that matters morally, whereas other kinds of love might not, or other kinds of projects might not. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much. So, one thing that you're asking is, how do we decide the scope of the love, of like the best version of the love conjecture? So my version of the love conjecture is about romantic love making a baby. And I've already clarified in a bunch of different, or sorry, I've already revised from what I said in the talk in a bunch of different ways. Like it has to, the romantic love has to make the baby via a plan to make a baby that we'll raise together. And it can't involve horribly mistreating anyone along the way. And there is this question, like, should it just be that two people love each other? Is it important that it be romantic love? What if it's two sisters? What if it's two friends who love each other? And let me tell you why I'm not sure that that's the best version of the love conjecture with a more expansive notion of love. Given that I've already conceded that we're, you know, if two people don't love each other but respect each other and make a plan, the baby can be theirs. We can have the fact that the baby is theirs without saying it's because of the love. And I'm inclined to think that there's something there's something good about families being led by two people who are in love with each other, romantic love. And that's part of why the love conjecture is true. Now, sometimes two people are in love with each other and they lead a family and it's a disaster. And so that's certainly also true. But that's part of what I think is ultimately behind the love conjecture.
It's been asked, really. I was just trying to get to this force of theirs. And what happens to the people who aren't born of love? Do they belong to nobody? And what kind of belonging is it? I mean, I can see that it makes a difference to you that you come out of this cloud, but what about all the people who don't come out of the cloud?
Good.
Are they just rootless in a moral sense?
So Janet asked the question on behalf of the many people who were not made by love. What about the rest of us? Do we just have sad origin stories? And I actually don't think so at all. So I just think there's lots of different ways that origin stories can be beautiful and meaningful. So I think, you know, a woman who had a one-night stand that was not a one night of love, and who had a surprise pregnancy and then raised their child might say to her child, you know, you were this amazing surprise, like the universe gave me exactly what I needed and I didn't even know. And that's a different kind of beautiful story. I just think there's a lot of different beautiful origin stories that can be meaningful to us in different ways. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to say that, Janet.
And Sadie.
Thank you. My name's Sadie Regby, and thank you. Really enjoyed that. My question's quite similar to sort of, what people have been pressing you on, so particularly Julia's. And I just wondered about this kind of privileging of romantic love, especially now that we're seeing so many different kinds of, so it might not even be two people in love. It might be potentially more than that, or it might be, a single person wanting to have a baby. I just wondered, if you have anything to say, anything more to say about that.
Okay, great. So the question is romantic love between two people really special? So one thought is that you could have a throuple of three people who all love each other, and they might want to have a family and raise the family together. And I am definitely open to a version of the love conjecture that says, like, when a group of people all love each other and want to make a family together. Yeah, that might be a very sensible version of the love conjecture that someone might hold. But then another question is, what about a single person who wants to make a baby and who makes a plan and gets other people involved and makes a baby? Isn't the baby hers or his? Isn't the baby theirs about the single person? Yeah, I think that if a single person makes a plan, there's this movie, probably no one here has seen it. It's from, at least 25 years ago, called Firelight. Has anyone seen this movie about a man who hires a woman to make a baby for him? I recommend this movie. Firelight. So, yeah, single people make babies on purpose, and those babies are theirs. And the love conjecture does not talk about that, but I think that's okay. Thanks.
Great. Lovely, please.
Thank you, Linda Eggert. I wanted to ask you about abortion that breaks a promise and how we get from sex ick to the more general principle that states, when it's never morally wrong to break a promise. And I was wondering whether there's a way to state that principle in even more general terms, because when you're talking about the sex ick case, I was wondering whether we could just say something like, sex is just one of those things that you shouldn't do because you promised to do it, that there might just be a category of things that, maybe you could promise, but having promised it should never be the reason. So do you think there are cases like that, and might sex and, maybe pregnancies fall into that could explain the general principle that we arrived to at the end of that section?
Okay, so the question is, what about a claim like this? Sex is the kind of thing that you should never do because you promised. That should never be your reason. And maybe pregnancies like that too. I just think those principles are false, the principles that you're proposing. So I think in the Ken and Kevin case, where they have a healthy sex life, but they're kind of busy, and Ken promises to have sex with Kevin on Tuesday night, but then he feels a little tired, but he knows he'd have a great time. I think there's a version of that case in which, yeah, he should keep his promise, and it's fine if a big part of why he starts having, fooling around with his husband is that he promised. I think that's totally fine. I also think, couples and couples counseling sometimes are advised to work on intimacy, and sometimes, you work on, you try to get in the mood. And there's a version of it where like it's too uncomfortable for you, and it's like the sex ick version of it, and you shouldn't do it. But there's other versions where, people should work on their marriages, and sometimes that means working on your sex lives, and there's a variety of ways to do that. As far as promising to be pregnant, there again, I think if, what do I think? I think, I was going to say that I thought that there were cases where you could promise to be pregnant and you should be pregnant because you promised. And I guess I do think that about surrogacy, there are some reasons for ending the surrogate pregnancy that are bad reasons, and the fact that you promised isn't undermined by the bad reasons to end the pregnancy. But as far as starting a pregnancy because of a promise, I have to think about it more, but I can kind of imagine a case where someone knows about herself that actually having a baby is a good idea for her in a lot of ways, and she's sort of torn, and the fact that she promised could play a role in her decision, like promised her partner who she loves. It's not crazy to think that could play a role.
David's next. We have 4 more questions and 5 minutes. So
we're not going to get through.
We're not going to get through all of them, but please make the questions brief.
So I'd like to ask. Thanks for the talk, Liz. I'd like to ask about.
You got to say your name, David.
David Enoch. At the end of section 3 on the handout, you say it's never morally wrong to break a promise to go through an experience that involves intimacy with someone else if you viscerally averse to it. Initially, I just want to ask whether it's pro tanto wrongness or all things considered wrongness that you're talking about here. But, and partly it's a request for more details, but partly it's, it could be the beginning of an objection if there is no way of filling in the details in a plausible way. It seems to me that the promise generates an obligation just in the way that promises typically do. I don't see a reason to think that's not the case. We can run the usual tests. If you are going to violate that, do you have to explain yourself or apologize or anything? It seems like all these things are there. There may be important other effects, like for instance, it may actually be sensitive, the all things considered judgment may actually be sensitive to just how one finds it, right? So the level matters. And also, it's important to see that even if we think about a case that it is all things considered wrong, it can still be excused. So there are other resources that we can use here.
Okay, so David asks about section 3 in which I talked about breaking promises, and I floated various principles according to which it's never wrong to break a promise in certain situations, and ultimately I endorsed one of those principles, that it's never wrong to break a promise to go through an experience that involves intimacy if you're viscerally averse to it and you anticipate the visceral aversion continuing during the intimate experience. David wants to know, when I say it's not morally wrong, do I mean there isn't even a pro tanto reason to keep the promise? Shouldn't you apologize for breaking the promise? Aren't there various further effects? And I just agree with that. So I think that promises do create pro tanto obligations to keep them. We need justification to break our promises, and this was me working through what would be an adequate justification. But it's still true that you broke a promise, and that's a serious matter. I totally agree with that. Then David asks, how do we distinguish the idea that it's okay to break the promise from a different claim, which is it's wrong to break the promise, but you have a good excuse, so you're not blameworthy? Those are just different. And I do think that that's something that someone might say instead about Daphne. So someone might say, actually, it's wrong for Daphne to abort, but she's just not blameworthy because she has this excuse. And that's just a different account of the case. I think there are various ways of testing, of thinking through which is true. And I think that's not right. I think she's not acting wrongly in aborting, but you might think the other thing. Thanks, David.
Probably the last question we managed to fit in so.
Thank you very much.
Your name?
Saul Smolansky. I'm trying to push a little bit and see, because I like all this love, and I just want to try to check how strong it can go, how far it can go. So let's assume that the case of surrogacy, just plain surrogacy, and that it's done by a woman who is very happy being pregnant, and nothing changes throughout, and she doesn't expect it to change, and she's doing it out of the money. But then at a certain stage, quite late in the pregnancy, we are setting aside, of course, the whole issue of the fetus, but quite late, she, and there's all this love that's built up and invested in this baby, but then she wins the lottery, and so she doesn't need their money. And and then you would, I think we would all agree that they're not allowed to, I don't know, kidnap her or something, force her to carry out the pregnancy till the end or something like that. But I'm wondering whether, and I'm inclined to, my intuition is, I want to see what yours is, that the fact that there's a lot of other stuff, but even the love itself, the strength of the love invested in this case, maybe implies that, for example, they can, setting aside, it's a moral issue, it's not a legal issue, but let's say they can sue her or threaten to sue her in some way that it will counter, that will actually, in a sense, force her to carry out the pregnancy towards the end. What would be your reaction there?
Okay, Saul, just so I am clear, you're imagining a gestational surrogate who's part, who wouldn't have done this if she didn't need the money, and then at some point in the pregnancy, she wins the lottery, and so she doesn't, but was it important to your question that it's later in the pregnancy that she wins the lottery? Okay, all right, well, let's talk about both versions of the case, because I think they're quite different. I think they're quite different cases. So one kind of case is where the gestational surrogate, who wouldn't be doing this if she didn't need the money, early in the pregnancy, she's already pregnant, but she wins the lottery. And at that point, she thinks, this is a huge pain, continuing this pregnancy. I have no reason to do this anymore, so she'd like to abort. So what do we think about that case? One thing that's going to be relevant in practice is whether, in fact, she's pregnant with an embryo that's genetically related to the intended parents, and whether they had like a limited number of embryos. So is it the case that in getting her pregnant and then her aborting, she's really undermining one of their chances, and maybe several embryos were used to try to get her pregnant? Has she undermined their chances of, say, making their own genetic child, which is important to them? I think that might matter to the morality of her choice. I have to admit that my gut reaction to the case, and I think it's okay if among us we differ, but my gut reaction is that it is okay for her to abort, that it is such a big thing that she still has before her to do, and she really her reason for doing, her situation has radically changed. So one interesting thing about promises is how does changes, surprises in our situations change whether we have to keep the promise. And I think it's not the case that the fact that something is unforeseen nullifies a promise. Absolutely not, but it does just raise a question. And the lottery is certainly unforeseen. If we think about towards much later in the pregnancy, then we're talking about whether to kill a member of the moral community, right? So the fetus is a member of the moral community for sure by a certain point in pregnancy. And so there I'm going to think that winning the lottery is not going to make that okay. Thanks so much.